The grand hall of Ashford Manor glimmered under the opulent glow of crystal chandeliers, each prism of light catching the tremble of a trembling hand, the flutter of a silk fan. Outside, the first hesitant drizzle of an early spring rain tapped against the tall, arched windows, a delicate percussion that seemed to echo the unsteady rhythm of her heart. Eleanor Whitmore stood near the far wall, her gloved hands folded tightly at her waist, a pale blue gown clinging modestly to her slender form. It was a dress meant to go unnoticed, yet in a room designed for notice, it betrayed her every fear. She had arrived with careful composure, yet the whispers had already begun, sliding through the crowd like a venomous perfume, reaching her ears in fragmented syllables. "Is that?" one lady murmured, eyes darting toward Eleanor's modest form. "Indeed she," another interrupted, voice clipped and cold. "I hear the story is unfortunate." Eleanor's stomach knotted. She lowered her gaze to the polished parquet floor, the mirror-bright surface reflecting her own hesitant steps. A delicate shiver ran through her, not from the draft sneaking beneath the tall windows, but from the weight of a society poised to dissect, judge, and discard. Every sideways glance, every sharp intake of breath from the ladies around her, felt like a scalpel slicing at the fragile dignity she had so carefully preserved. The blue of her dress, once a comfort in its muted serenity, now seemed to mock her, a pale beacon amidst the black silks and ruby velvets of her peers. She had always feared the eyes of men. Not the polite curiosity, but the scrutiny that probed too deeply, that weighed her worth as though it were a commodity to be measured and found wanting. Yet tonight, it was one man in particular whose presence sent a shiver deeper than any whisper or glare. Lord Nathaniel Ashford, the heir to the manor, a man whose reputation for indifference and austere temper preceded him, stood at the opposite end of the hall. His coat, dark and impeccably tailored, bore the faint sheen of rain along the collar. His dark hair, brushed back from a sharp, defined forehead, glistened slightly with dampness, lending him an almost otherworldly severity. He observed the crowd, yet his eyes, a piercing gray, swept briefly across Eleanor, and in that instant, the world felt smaller, narrower, more unbearable. A hush fell as he approached, measured footsteps carrying authority across the polished floor. Eleanor's pulse caught, not in anticipation but in terror. What could he want? The whisper seemed to condense into a tangible pressure around her, a visible miasma of suspicion and silent judgment. She felt exposed, stripped of the careful armor she had constructed over years of quiet retreat and muted smiles. Her past, her scars, both those that marred her flesh and those etched into the folds of her heart, were known to a select few. Tonight she feared they would be visible to all. The murmur of conversation ceased as Nathaniel's gaze lingered, and the room seemed to contract around Eleanor, each breath a labor, each heartbeat a drum of impending revelation. He moved with the precision of one accustomed to command, yet there was no smile, no overt recognition, only the quiet, unsettling weight of his attention. She felt it like a hand pressing against her chest, steady and inescapable. A footman approached, murmuring her name, and Eleanor turned with the measured politeness her mother had drilled into her since childhood. "Miss Whitmore," he said, bowing slightly, his voice low enough to be polite yet urgent enough to unsettle, "Lord Ashford requests your presence." Eleanor's throat constricted. She nodded, forcing the semblance of calm, and stepped forward. The hall, with its gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers, seemed to stretch endlessly before her, every polished surface reflecting the tension coiled within her chest. The whispers rose anew, sharper, pricking at her resolve. She could feel the eyes of society upon her, each glance a verdict, each murmur a subtle indictment. Nathaniel did not speak as she drew near. His gray eyes met hers with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare, yet not entirely unprotected. There was no malice there, no overt cruelty, but a profound indifference that was somehow worse, a silent acknowledgment of her existence, measured and weighing her worth with the cold scales of judgment. Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, gloved fingers pressing into the fabric of her gown, grounding herself against the tide of panic that threatened to sweep her away. "Miss Whitmore," he finally said, his voice smooth, controlled, and carrying the faintest edge of curiosity, "it seems fortune, or misfortune, has guided you to Ashford Manor tonight." Eleanor swallowed, tasting the dry bitterness of fear on her tongue. She forced a curt nod, attempting a reply that would satisfy both propriety and self-preservation. "Lord Ashford, I thank you for your welcome," she stammered, each word a careful construction of restraint. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, passed over his features, so brief that she wondered if it had been imagined. The room seemed to tilt slightly, as if the chandeliers themselves leaned closer to witness the subtle collision of two fates. Around them, the crowd shifted, a living sea of silks and whispered judgments, yet in that space Eleanor felt the world narrow to the span of a single breath between them. Then a careless laugh from a nearby lady, a high, brittle sound, sliced through the fragile tension. Heads turned, and Eleanor's face burned with the rush of humiliation. Nathaniel's eyes, unflinching, met hers once more, and for a heartbeat, a strange vulnerability surfaced beneath his austere exterior. Yet he said nothing, only allowed her to feel the weight of the room, the sting of whispers, and the piercing scrutiny of a society determined to define her. Eleanor took a measured step back, retreating toward the edge of the hall, her gown whispering against the polished floor. Each step was deliberate, yet heavy with the dread of exposure, each breath an effort to reclaim composure she barely felt. And as she paused near the shadowed corner, glancing back, Nathaniel's gaze followed, unwavering and unreadable, a silent promise, or perhaps a warning, that he had seen more than she intended to reveal, more than society had permitted her to hide. A single bead of rain slid down the glass behind him, catching the light of the chandeliers like a small, burning star. Eleanor's heart thrummed violently, her mind a whirl of shame, fear, and a curious, reluctant fascination. The hall had become a crucible of judgment, yet within it, a spark flickered, small, uncertain, but undeniable. Nathaniel Ashford had seen her, truly seen her, in a way that no other had dared. And for that recognition she both trembled and longed. The whispers persisted, cruel and relentless, but Eleanor's gaze lifted, drawn once more to the man who seemed a fortress of indifference. And in that suspended moment, as the rain whispered against the windows and the chandeliers shimmered like distant stars, she realized that the night had only just begun, and that the man who did not care might yet become the one whose attention could shatter or save her entirely. The following morning, the manor gardens lay veiled in a silvery mist, dew glistening on the tender shoots of early spring roses, their petals heavy with rain. Eleanor wandered along the stone pathways, her footsteps quiet against the slick cobblestones, the soft rustle of her skirts the only sound to accompany the distant roll of a carriage wheel. The world seemed suspended, as if it held its breath, waiting for something unseen yet inevitable to unfold. In her hand she clutched a small, folded note, its paper worn, the ink faintly smudged from hurried fingers. She had found it tucked beneath her chamber door earlier, a delicate sprig of lily of the valley pressed between its pages. The handwriting was unfamiliar, precise, almost commanding, yet carried an intimacy that sent a shiver through her chest. Her pulse quickened as she unfolded the note. "Meet me where the garden turns toward the fountain." It read, simple, unadorned, yet laden with intent. Eleanor's fingers trembled. Each beat of her heart seemed magnified in the stillness. The garden was vast, and the mist softened the outlines of statues and hedges, turning familiar paths into a shifting labyrinth. She felt the weight of the morning press upon her, a mingling of fear and curiosity, each step a delicate negotiation between courage and restraint. As she rounded a curve, the stone fountain emerged through the fog, its marble surface slick with rain, water trembling over its edge like the pulse of a living thing. And there, at the fountain's center, stood Nathaniel Ashford. He had shed the cloak of formalities, yet retained a poise that seemed almost unnatural in its precision. His hands were clasped behind his back, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the garden as though expecting her, yet detached, unreadable. Eleanor froze for a heartbeat, the chill of mist mingling with the heat of awareness that he was waiting, watching, judging, not cruelly, yet without the warmth she longed for. She stepped forward cautiously, her gown whispering against the cobblestones, and Nathaniel's gaze followed, unwavering. "Miss Whitmore," he said, voice low but carrying easily across the damp morning air, "you have accepted my invitation." His tone was neither welcoming nor cold, but measured, precise, a challenge and a curiosity entwined. Eleanor inclined her head, cheeks flushed with a color that the morning fog could not conceal. I found your note," she replied softly, voice trembling despite her best efforts at poise. "I was unsure whether it was meant for me." He allowed a slow exhale, a subtle shift in his posture that betrayed a fraction of the human beneath the impeccable exterior. "It was. I wished to speak without the audience of Ashford Manor observing every motion, every glance, every whispered inference," he said. "The world is unkind to those who cannot, or will not, conform to its dictates. You know this all too well." Eleanor's chest tightened at his words. He spoke as one who understood, yet there was no comfort, only recognition, and the weight of that acknowledgment pressed upon her. They walked together along the fountain's edge, the mist curling about them like a shroud. Nathaniel's eyes occasionally lifted to hers, lingering in moments that felt deliberately charged with silent meaning. "The garden," he said, "has always been a refuge, yet even here the world intrudes. Rumor is relentless, and your circumstances, Miss Whitmore, have made you a subject of its sharpest whispers." Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came. Her past, the secrets and scars she had fought to conceal, seemed suddenly raw, exposed in the gray light of morning. Then, a sudden ripple of laughter came from the far end of the garden. Eleanor's stomach clenched. Two ladies, draped in the finest silks and pearls, emerged from the mist, their parasols tilted like weapons. They paused, seeing her near Nathaniel, and exchanged knowing glances. "Well," one said with the brittle elegance of practiced cruelty, "it seems Miss Whitmore has been favored or perhaps sought after. Curious indeed." Their laughter, sharp and brittle, pierced the dampened serenity of the garden. Eleanor felt the old surge of shame, prickling like fire along her skin. Nathaniel's hand, steady and precise, brushed against hers, a subtle touch that anchored her trembling. "Ignore them," he said, voice low, carrying a restrained authority. "Their opinions are inconsequential, built of envy and fear rather than truth." Eleanor's fingers pressed instinctively against the cool stone of the fountain, grounding herself against the tremor in her chest. There was comfort in his presence, yet it was tempered by the awareness of the social storm gathering invisibly around them. Minutes passed in a delicate tension, the mist thickening as the morning light grew stronger. Eleanor found herself speaking, words she had long held behind carefully measured lips spilling softly. Why do you pay attention to me, Lord Ashford? You are unbending, admired, feared even. And I am hardly a subject worthy of notice." Nathaniel's gaze softened imperceptibly, a flicker that made her pulse accelerate. "Miss Whitmore, worth is not defined by society's measure," he said. "It is defined by what is seen, not whispered. And there are things about you, concealed and remarkable, that the world has failed to recognize." Her breath caught, a strange mixture of fear, longing, and incredulity intertwining. Could a man like him, so composed, so detached, truly perceive the hidden scars she had carried both on her flesh and in her spirit? Yet his words carried weight, a resonance that stirred hope even amidst dread. She dared a glance upward, and for a fleeting moment, their eyes locked, gray and storm-tossed, yet fathomless in their intensity. Then the subtle gesture arrived, a single lily of the valley, the very sprig she had found with the note, now extended from his hand. It was a gift of extraordinary simplicity, yet Eleanor felt it as a declaration, delicate, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Her fingers hovered over it, trembling, and in the silence that stretched between them, the world narrowed to the faint pulse of shared breath, the soft rustle of silk against stone, the distant echo of footsteps beyond the mist. But even as her heart dared to lift, the whispers of society intruded once more. From the shadowed edge of the garden, another figure approached, one whose presence promised scrutiny, scandal, or both. The air shifted, heavier now, a reminder that the delicate equilibrium they had carved in the fog was fragile, and that every gesture, every word, might ignite rumor into fire. Eleanor's pulse quickened, a delicate thrill mingling with the ache of anticipation. Nathaniel's gaze remained fixed on her, unwavering, yet aware of the approaching disturbance. In that suspended instant, Eleanor understood with a quiet certainty. The path ahead would be fraught with peril, scandal, and revelation, yet it was a path she could not turn from. The gift in her hand, the weight of his gaze, and the intensity of their silent communion had altered something fundamental within her. And as the mist thickened and the distant figure drew near, Eleanor felt the first fragile stirrings of courage, the delicate, trembling promise that perhaps for the first time, someone had truly seen her, scars and all. The infirmary was quiet, the scent of wax and disinfectant mingling with the faint aroma of rosewood from the polished floorboards. Rain streaked against the tall, arched windows, casting elongated shadows that danced across the room like restless spirits. Eleanor sat on a narrow wooden chair, hands folded tightly in her lap, the paper of Nathaniel's note still pressed between her fingers as though it were a talisman against the rising tide of fear. She had been summoned here by circumstance, an injured servant, a minor accident, but found herself enveloped by a hush that felt almost conspiratorial, as if the room itself recognized the gravity of what might unfold. Nathaniel stood near the doorway, coat removed, sleeves rolled back to reveal sharp forearms, the lines of his posture precise, unwavering. He regarded her not with the judgmental gaze of society, but with a measured intensity that made Eleanor's pulse stutter. Every movement he made seemed deliberate, each step calculated to command presence without overwhelming the fragile equilibrium she struggled to maintain. The rain outside tapped in a quiet rhythm, and the muted light softened his austere features, revealing a hint of vulnerability that the public rarely, if ever, witnessed. Eleanor's voice broke the silence, low and tentative. "Lord Ashford." She paused, struggling to find the courage to speak the word she had held for so long, the one she had buried beneath layers of propriety and self-preservation. "I fear that my past and the marks it has left might render me unworthy of regard." Her words faltered, each syllable heavy with dread, yet she could not turn away from the truth pressing insistently against her chest. Nathaniel stepped closer, the distance between them narrowing, yet careful not to crowd her. "You speak of scars, Miss Whitmore?" His voice was calm yet charged, as though every word carried the weight of a revelation. Eleanor's hands instinctively moved to cover the faint ridges along her forearms, the remnants of injuries she had once thought private, invisible to the world but indelibly etched into her sense of self. She had lived in fear that any exposure would result in derision or dismissal, and yet, faced with Nathaniel's unwavering gaze, she felt the strange stirrings of trust. "Yes," she whispered, scarcely audible over the gentle patter of rain. I have carried them for years. And not only the marks on my skin but the shame of misjudgment, whispers, and assumptions. They follow me even here." Her breath trembled, the confession a delicate surrender. The room seemed to constrict, the shadows pressing closer, yet simultaneously, a fragile warmth emerged, a sense that someone had crossed the threshold of her solitude and seen more than mere appearances. Nathaniel's eyes softened, imperceptibly yet undeniably. He moved a step closer, the light catching the faint curve of his jaw, revealing a flicker of emotion carefully veiled beneath a lifetime of restraint. "Miss Whitmore," he said quietly, "you speak of burdens that the world has forced upon you, burdens no one should bear alone. Yet I see something more than the scars. I see resilience, courage measured and unspoken, a dignity that survives in spite of cruelty." Eleanor's lips parted, a mixture of astonishment and disbelief tracing her features. No one had ever described her thus, not in society, not in letters, not in the hushed whispers behind closed doors. A shiver passed through her, though whether from the cool draft sneaking beneath the tall windows or from the intensity of his gaze, she could not tell. Her voice, when it emerged, was steadier than she expected. "And you do not recoil? Or despise me?" The question hung in the air, delicate and frail, yet it carried the weight of years, a single thread of hope tangled with fear. Nathaniel's lips curved in a faint, enigmatic line, neither full smile nor grimace, but a subtle acknowledgment that spoke volumes. "I do not recoil," he said, voice steady, deliberate. "Nor do I despise. I am aware, Miss Whitmore, that the world often mistakes fear for weakness, misfortune for defect. But I have seen enough to know that appearances can be deceiving, that what lies beneath is what commands true attention." He paused, allowing the words to sink, to breathe, to settle in the tender hush of the room. Eleanor's heart, so long accustomed to silence and judgment, thudded in sudden rhythm with hope. She dared a cautious step forward, the soft rustle of her skirts a whisper against the wooden floor. "And do you think it possible that one such as I might?" Her voice faltered, leaving the thought unfinished, fragile as the misted glass beyond the windows. Nathaniel extended his hand, a gesture of deliberate calm, yet charged with significance. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "it is not impossible. The measure of a person is not in what society chooses to see, but in what is revealed to those patient enough to look beyond. You have revealed much tonight, more than many ever dare, and it commands regard, not scorn." Eleanor's fingers trembled as they hovered above his extended hand, the simple act imbued with an intimacy that neither words nor society could dictate. In that gesture she felt both fear and invitation, a delicate acknowledgement of connection, and a promise that the night's revelations were not yet fully understood. The warmth of his presence, the steadiness of his gaze, seemed to illuminate the hidden corners of her self-doubt, softening the harsh lines of insecurity and shame. The silence that followed was thick, rich, and deliberate, punctuated only by the rain's gentle percussion. Eleanor dared to glance up fully, meeting Nathaniel's eyes with an intensity that made the room itself seem smaller, enclosed around the fragile moment. There was no rush, no expectation beyond presence itself, and yet in that measured stillness, an understanding passed between them, unspoken, profound, and tremulously tender. Then, without warning, a sharp sound from the corridor outside, a door creaking under a careless push, reminded Eleanor of the world beyond the infirmary. The moment of intimate revelation, delicate and private, seemed poised on the edge of intrusion. She drew a subtle breath, realizing that the fragile sanctuary they had carved could vanish with a single step of an onlooker, a servant, or a passerby. Nathaniel's eyes followed hers toward the sound, a brief shadow of alertness passing across his features, and yet he did not release her hand. Instead, he maintained the small, deliberate closeness, a quiet defiance against the outside world, as though presence alone could shield them from intrusion. Eleanor's chest rose and fell rapidly, a mixture of exhilaration, fear, and the first true recognition that she was at last seen, acknowledged, not merely for appearances, but for the depth of courage, fragility, and resilience she carried silently. In that suspended moment, Eleanor felt the stirrings of something she had never allowed herself. The fragile, trembling hope that recognition by a single exacting soul might be enough to withstand the relentless scrutiny of the world beyond. And as Nathaniel's gaze held hers, unyielding yet gentle, she realized that the night's confessions had shifted something fundamental, a delicate balance between fear and trust, shame and acceptance. Outside, the rain continued, soft and insistent, and Eleanor sensed the faint shadow of society pressing against the edges of the infirmary. Yet within that small, dimly lit room, there existed a fragile defiance, a quiet affirmation that the world's whispers could not dictate the truths revealed in moments of intimate honesty. And as a distant footfall approached the doorway, the tension coiled, Eleanor's heart thrummed with the exquisite terror and exhilaration of being truly, undeniably seen. The evening air was heavy with the scent of damp roses and freshly polished wood as the grand ballroom of Ashford Manor filled with murmurs and music. Candles flickered in ornate sconces, casting quivering light across the gleaming parquet floor, crystal chandeliers above catching each shimmer and sparkle in fractured brilliance. Eleanor entered cautiously, her gown a soft silver blue, the delicate folds catching the light as though every shimmer carried a prayer for composure. The whispers had begun the moment she appeared, drifting across the room like insidious perfume. "She dares appear here again," one lady murmured, the words sharp with venom. "After what they say," a stiff laugh followed, brittle as a winter branch breaking under frost. Eleanor's chest constricted, and she lowered her gaze, pressing her gloved hands to her sides, each step measured to maintain dignity under the weight of scrutiny. Nathaniel Ashford waited near the center of the room, his presence commanding without ostentation. Even amidst the swirl of silk and jewels, he was an immovable anchor, the epitome of control and authority. His gray eyes, storm-tossed and piercing, found hers immediately, holding her in a quiet but undeniable acknowledgement. Eleanor felt the familiar shiver of anticipation mixed with fear, the same rush that had coursed through her during their garden encounter, magnified now by the presence of society, all eyes poised like daggers ready to judge. A harp trill rose from the corner, the music soft, tentative, yet precise. Nathaniel stepped toward her, the room bending subtly around the weight of his movement, as if the chandeliers themselves leaned closer in anticipation. Eleanor's breath caught. Every whisper, every glance, was magnified by the candlelight, every movement of her gown, every tilt of her head, a potential invitation to scrutiny. Yet he did not hesitate, did not falter, as if he alone possessed the measure of courage necessary to confront the world's judgment. "Miss Whitmore," his voice, smooth and deliberate, cut through the chatter and music alike, drawing attention without seeming to seek it. All eyes turned, and Eleanor felt the collective gaze of the room settle upon her like winter frost. Her pulse quickened, a mingling of fear and pride rising within her chest. Nathaniel's gray eyes held hers, steady, unflinching, carrying the weight of command and intent that no rumor or whisper could dilute. He gestured subtly, a single hand extended, and Eleanor, with trembling grace, took it. The touch, though light, conveyed a promise of protection and acknowledgement, a declaration in its simplest form. Gasps rippled through the assembly, some of shock, others of envy, but Nathaniel did not flinch. He lifted his chin slightly as though daring the world to challenge the rightness of his choice. And for the first time, Eleanor felt the fragile bloom of courage awaken fully within her. They moved together to the center of the ballroom, the floor beneath them polished and gleaming, each step deliberate. Eleanor's breath came in quiet bursts. The eyes around her burned, yet she felt a strange, serene defiance settle within. Nathaniel's voice rose again, calm but carrying a weight that silenced all but the most insolent whispers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, the words clear, deliberate, Miss Eleanor Whitmore stands before you not as a subject of rumor, but as a woman whose dignity and fortitude demand respect. Let us recall that true character is revealed not in the judgments whispered behind fans, but in the courage one bears when confronted by adversity. The ballroom fell into stunned silence, a fragile hush broken only by the soft intonation of the harp in the corner. Eleanor's pulse thundered in her ears, yet she stood taller, shoulders squared, the silver-blue fabric of her gown rippling softly with the deliberate grace of someone reclaiming her space in the world. She dared a glance at Nathaniel, and his expression, stern yet infinitely tender, gave her permission to be seen, to exist fully without apology. A murmur of disbelief, followed by tentative applause, began to circulate through the crowd. Some ladies clutched their pearls and fans, mouths pressing into tight lines, while a few of the gentlemen inclined their heads with subtle approval, the air crackling with the tension of societal norms being quietly, irrevocably challenged. Eleanor felt an unexpected warmth rise through her, a combination of fear, exhilaration, and the first true taste of validation since her arrival at the manor. Nathaniel's gaze softened as he drew slightly closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "You are remarkable, Eleanor," he whispered, the words carrying more weight than the grandeur of the room could contain. "Not despite what the world has tried to make you, but because of the strength you have shown through it." Her fingers trembled, brushing the small fabric of his sleeve in a gesture unspoken yet profoundly intimate. The tension of weeks, the constant awareness of judgment, began to melt in the quiet authority of his acknowledgement. Yet even amidst triumph, the shadow of society's scrutiny lingered, subtle but insistent. Eleanor's pulse faltered as a sudden cough drew her attention to the edge of the ballroom. One of the ladies, red-faced with anger and envy, stepped forward, her voice sharp, brittle with indignation. "Lord Ashford," she demanded, "this favor, this acknowledgement of a woman with such history, surely it cannot stand unchallenged." The words were venomous, yet Nathaniel's posture did not waver. He lifted a single hand, steady, deliberate, and spoke in a tone that brooked no interruption. "Society may speak in whispers," he said, eyes fixed unwaveringly on the woman, "but my judgment does not bend to rumor or fear. Miss Whitmore's worth is her own, and I will not permit it to be defined by cruelty disguised as propriety." The room seemed to exhale, the chandeliers above shimmering in response, the echoes of his declaration reverberating through polished walls. Eleanor felt her chest rise with a mixture of relief and awe, as though the weight of every whispered insult had been lifted in a single, decisive act. Nathaniel extended his hand once more, and Eleanor took it with a newfound confidence, their fingers entwined in a gesture that spoke volumes beyond words. The world outside the ballroom, the whispers, the judgment, the small cruelties, seemed momentarily suspended, irrelevant in the face of this quiet, resolute assertion. She realized in that instant that the man who had once appeared indifferent had become her shield, and that the fragile spark between them had ignited into something undeniable. But even as the applause rose softly, and the crowd began to murmur with hesitant admiration, a subtle shift occurred. From the far doorway, a shadow emerged, tall and deliberate, carrying the promise of intrusion, revelation, or scandal yet unseen. Eleanor's pulse quickened again, the fragile triumph of the ballroom tempered by the knowledge that the world outside their fragile sanctuary had not yet relinquished its hold. Nathaniel's hand tightened subtly around hers, a silent promise that he had seen her fully, yet the tension in his eyes mirrored her own, the understanding that their triumph was not yet complete, and that the next moment could tilt everything once more. The chandeliers reflected on the polished floor, the candle flames flickered like small, anxious hearts, and Eleanor felt the fragile thrill of being fully seen, scars, pride and all, while the shadow at the doorway remained, a reminder that the path toward acceptance and love was far from finished. And in that suspended heartbeat, she knew with a certainty both terrifying and exhilarating that the night's revelation was only the beginning, and that the man who had once seemed indifferent might now be the force that determined her fate. The first light of dawn filtered softly through the tall windows of Ashford Manor, painting the marble floors in muted gold and silver, a gentle promise of renewal. Eleanor stood at the edge of the terrace, the morning mist curling around her gown like delicate smoke, her fingers brushing the carved balustrade as though it were a lifeline. The events of the previous night, whispers, gazes, the subtle defiance of scandal, had left her both exhilarated and exhausted. Nathaniel had remained by her side through every challenge, his presence a constant, unspoken assurance that she was no longer alone in the scrutiny of society. Yet even as the garden awoke around her, the shadow of judgment lingered, subtle but unrelenting, reminding her that courage was only half the battle. Acceptance, both personal and public, remained to be claimed. Nathaniel emerged from the terrace doorway, coat brushed from the damp of early morning, dark hair still slightly damp from the lingering mist. His gray eyes, storm-tossed yet steady, found Eleanor's, a silent communication passing between them that required no words. "The hour has come," he said softly, voice deliberate and measured, "to show not merely to one another but to the world what it is we have chosen to defend and cherish." Eleanor turned fully to face him, the sunlight catching the delicate folds of her silver-blue gown, highlighting the subtle resilience in her posture. She drew a deep breath, feeling the pulse of anticipation thrumming in her veins, a mingling of fear and exhilaration that mirrored the rhythm of the awakening manor around them. They descended the grand staircase together, fingers brushing, a deliberate demonstration of solidarity. The hall was already filling with the quiet hum of early guests, family, acquaintances, and the persistent, watchful eyes of society. Each step Eleanor took echoed against polished stone, a measured cadence that seemed to assert her right to be present, right to stand unashamed in the full view of those who had whispered and judged. Nathaniel's hand, firm at her elbow, offered both guidance and reassurance, a subtle claim of protection that reinforced the fragile confidence she had nurtured through the storm of scrutiny. As they reached the center of the ballroom, the chandeliers catching the dawn's first light, Eleanor felt the collective gaze of those assembled press upon her. Some eyes were curious, some cold, some tinged with reluctant admiration. Yet she no longer trembled. The previous night's private acknowledgment, the subtle defiance against rumor, and Nathaniel's unwavering presence had transformed the fear she once carried into a quiet, potent determination. She would not be defined by whispers. She would not retreat. Not now, not ever again. Nathaniel stepped slightly ahead, raising his hand to draw attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice resonant yet tempered with elegance, "I trust you are all aware of the events that have unfolded over recent weeks concerning Miss Eleanor Whitmore." His gaze swept across the room, precise, unwavering. "There have been rumors, whispers, questions of propriety, and conjecture regarding her character. And yet, here she stands not as a subject of speculation, but as a woman whose strength, dignity, and courage compel recognition." The words fell like a measured incantation, deliberate and sharp, silencing murmurs and commanding focus. Eleanor's chest rose and fell steadily. Each syllable of Nathaniel's declaration fortified her own resolve. She could feel the tension coiling in the room, the fragile balance of judgment and curiosity teetering on the precipice of revelation. A single lady, face flushed with envy, pressed her gloved hand to her chest, disbelief etched in every line of her posture. Eleanor felt a flicker of triumph. Society, for all its rigidity, could not erase the authority of truth, the quiet power of courage expressed fully and without apology. Nathaniel extended his hand toward her, a gesture deliberate and intimate, yet public. Eleanor took it without hesitation, fingers interlacing with his. The touch, simple yet profound, conveyed an unspoken promise, that she would no longer be alone, that every whispered slight and every shadowed judgment could be met with steadfast presence and unwavering loyalty. Their eyes met, a silent communion passing between them, gray and storm-tossed, resilient and tender, a recognition of shared struggle and emerging triumph. A ripple of applause began, hesitant at first, then gathering strength as a few of the gentlemen inclined their heads, acknowledging the authority and dignity of both Eleanor and Nathaniel. She felt a thrill, not of vanity but of liberation, a fragile yet undeniable triumph over the tyranny of whispered judgment. Yet even amidst this small victory, a shadow of tension lingered. From the far doorway, a figure stepped forward, deliberate and composed, whose presence carried the potential for challenge, scandal, or revelation unanticipated. Eleanor's pulse quickened, the thrill of victory tempered by the sharp reminder that society's scrutiny was never fully absent. Nathaniel's grip tightened slightly, reassuring, protective. "Fear not," he murmured, voice low but firm, "for what is revealed here is nothing less than truth, and truth commands respect." Eleanor nodded, absorbing the weight of his words, feeling the steady rise of courage within her chest. She no longer sought permission to exist in the world's gaze. She claimed it fully, deliberately, alongside the man who had seen her wholly, scars and spirit alike. The figure at the doorway was Lady Pennington, a woman of sharp tongue and subtle cruelty, long accustomed to dictating social favor. Her eyes narrowed, lips pressing into a thin line as she stepped forward, the echo of her heels striking the polished floor like deliberate warning shots. "Lord Ashford," she said, voice smooth but edged, "surely propriety and reputation demand restraint. Public acknowledgement of associations with Miss Whitmore? Is. Nathaniel raised a single hand, silencing her with a quiet, formidable authority. Propriety is meaningless when weighed against truth and character, he said evenly, yet with an intensity that caused even Lady Pennington to falter. Miss Whitmore is a woman of courage, of intellect, and of dignity. I will not permit rumor, envy, or social posturing to dictate the recognition that is hers by right. Eleanor felt the room shift, the air charged with the energy of confrontation and resolution. Every eye turned toward them, every whispered doubt tempered by the unmistakable weight of authority and conviction. She lifted her gaze fully meeting Nathaniel's, and in that instant all fear, all uncertainty, all past shame fell away. She saw, reflected in his eyes, not only recognition but steadfast devotion, an unwavering commitment to see her wholly, without apology, without concealment. "Nathaniel," she breathed, voice trembling with the weight of unshed tears, "thank you for seeing me." He inclined his head, expression softening, yet resolute. "I have seen you, Eleanor, fully. And I will continue to do so, regardless of whispers, regardless of judgment. There is no shame in the scars we carry, only the strength with which we bear them." The room seemed to exhale collectively, the tension dissolving as if the force of truth had dispelled the lingering shadow of gossip. Eleanor felt the warmth of exhilaration, mingled with a tremulous sense of peace. The man who had once appeared indifferent had become her unwavering anchor, and she realized that the delicate, trembling spark that had first flickered in the misted garden had grown into a flame impossible to extinguish. A sudden hush fell as Nathaniel drew closer, hands gently taking hers, fingers interlacing firmly. Eleanor's breath caught as he spoke, voice low, deliberate, yet carrying the intensity of confession. "Eleanor Whitmore," he said, "the world may demand compliance, but I demand truth. I choose you not as a subject of rumor, but as the woman whose courage, dignity, and spirit inspire me. Will you accept this bond, knowing the world may not yet approve, but we know it to be right?" Tears rose to her eyes, but she smiled, fragile and radiant, the weight of years of fear and concealment dissolving in a single potent moment. "Yes, Nathaniel," she whispered, voice steady, voice carrying the resonance of every wound endured, every whisper endured, every scar borne. "I accept, wholly and without fear." The ballroom seemed to hold its breath as they stood, hand in hand, united and defiant, the sunlight filtering through the windows like a benediction. Even Lady Pennington, rigid and imperious, faltered, lips pressed in tight disapproval, yet the room had shifted irreversibly. Truth and courage had triumphed over rumor, over cruelty, over the tyranny of whispered judgment. And as Nathaniel raised Eleanor's hand to his lips, brushing it lightly with a reverence that sent a shiver through her spine, she realized fully that she had been seen, not as a rumor, not as a subject of fear, not as the sum of her scars, but as herself, whole, remarkable, and cherished. Yet outside the windows, the morning mist lingered, curling along the gardens and winding pathways, hinting that the world beyond these walls had not yet fully relinquished its gaze. Eleanor knew, as Nathaniel's steady hand held hers, that challenges would come again, whispers would rise once more, and society's judgment would continue to test them. But in that moment, in the golden quiet of dawn and candlelight, they had claimed their triumph together, a bond forged in recognition, courage, and the enduring power of love fully realized.